So the next section, we're going to deal with consumer guarantees. So these are terms inserted into all of the contracts involving consumer transactions by statute, by the Australian consumer law. So they're statutory terms. And we were talking about them last week as they can be a type of a term of the contract. And in this case, people can't get out of this term if it's a consumer transaction. These terms are in the contract. So let's get into some of the main statutory terms under consumer law. So consumer law means that suppliers, retailers and manufacturers must give certain guarantees when they sell goods or services. This consumer guarantee is a statutory term of the contract. It's a contractual term imposed by Parliament on consumer transactions. If a good or service doesn't comply with the consumer guarantees, the consumer can take action to get a remedy, such as getting a refund or replacement. So our first thing to understand is what is a consumer transaction. Section 3 of the Australian Consumer Law defines what a consumer is or what a consumer transaction involves. So it's a transaction of any type of goods or services less than $40,000 or less, $40,000 or less than or equal to $40,000, right? So if it's less than or equal to $40,000, it's a consumer transaction. Or the goods or services costing more than 40 if those goods and services are normally acquired for personal, domestic or household use. Okay? So if it's under 40, it's in. If it's over 40 and for goods normally acquired for personal, domestic or household use, again, it's in. So actually you could buy a $50,000 stove that would be in, right? Because stoves are normally acquired for personal, domestic or household use. Now the exception, right, unless the goods are acquired for the purposes of resupply or the purpose of using them up or transforming them. So what you can see is if a company is buying something as part of its supply chain, it's not in. Okay, so if we buy flour from the shop to make some bread, it's in. It's a consumer transaction, right? Both because it's less than 40,000 and normally people who buy flour are using it for personal domestic. If a baker buys it, it's out, right? Because they're going to turn it into bread which they resupply, which they transform and resupply. Okay, so we're going to have some practice about how this applies, but it's a great little it's a great little section. Let's say it's a big section in the real law. It's actually much more extensive than this, but this summary of it gives us a good way of thinking about how the law operates. It's this or that, unless except for these situations, and some practice on this would be something that's well worthwhile. Okay, just say we've got a consumer transaction. What are the actual guarantees? Well, in terms of goods, the goods must be of acceptable quality, the goods must be fit for a disclosed purpose, and the goods must correspond with any description given for them. That's sections 54, 55 and 56. In terms of services, like you get a car wash, the services need to be rendered with due care and skill, and the services or the product resulting from the services need to be fit for any disclosed purpose. So that's where we're kind of getting, these are kind of similar elements here, where in one we've got a good, right? And in one we've got an intangible, a service that we're getting. Look at the first one, acceptable quality. Goods need to be of acceptable quality. So if you buy a cup of coffee, it has to be acceptably good enough to drink. Goods are of acceptable quality if they're fit for the purposes which the goods of that kind are commonly supplied, and acceptable in appearance and finish, and free from defects, and safe, and durable. Okay, there's a lot of ands in there. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, take A, right? If you buy a chair, it needs to be fit for sitting in. It doesn't mean you can use it to hold up planks as scaffolding. It just needs to be for what you would normally use that kind of good. It needs to be acceptable in appearance and finish. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, that kind of depends, right? Many of these elements depend, like durability. How durable does a product have to be? Well, again, that depends. What does it depend on? It depends on actually the kind of product, okay? So, for instance, milk will be less durable. It's going to last a lot longer than a steel chair, a lot shorter period than a steel chair. And a steel chair will be more durable than a plastic chair. Okay, so it's about a reasonableness for the product type, but also the product kind of how it's marketed. So if you buy a pair of shoes that new cost, I don't know, $10, the law doesn't expect them to be as durable as a pair of shoes that cost $100 or $150. Okay, so they look at how they're marketed and the price when determining these elements. But they need to be acceptable in appearance and finish, have no defects, be safe and durable. However, that acceptable quality doesn't apply if the consumer causes the problem or the consumer who is buying the goods examined them before they agreed to the supply of the goods, and that examination ought reasonably to have revealed the problem. What's this one about? This one is about, for instance, if you go to the IKEA shop, at the end, near where the checkout is, there's a kind of seconds part of the store. What is it? It's got some furniture that's being banged about a bit, got a nick out of it, and they'll sell it to you cheaper. Okay, now you know that when you're buying it. Okay, and it's up to you if you're buying it under those conditions to have a good look at it. So Section 54(7) is trying to cover those kind of situations where part of the deal is you know that the goods aren't going to be perhaps as good as what they would be under ideal conditions, but you still want to buy it at a cheaper price. Now, the second one can sound like something being of acceptable quality, but it's a little bit different. In this, goods need to be fit for the purpose disclosed by the consumer. Okay, so you have to go to the merchant and say, hey, will this chair be good enough for me to stand on to change light bulbs? Now, if the merchant says yes, then it has to be good enough to do that, even though you don't ordinarily stand on chairs and use them as ladders, okay? So once you disclose the purpose to the merchant and they say that it's fit for that purpose, okay, then it has to be fit for that purpose. So the key marker here is that the consumer is asking what the goods might be used for, and the merchant says, yes, they are. Now, that won't apply if the consumer doesn't rely on the supplier's skill, which would be hard to make out, but if you could, or if it was unreasonable for the consumer to do so. The final section for goods is Section 56. Goods must correspond with description. Okay. What does that mean? Okay, just say you went in and you bought a towel and it was in a box and you couldn't see it and it was a blue and it's described as a blue towel. Well, if you get it home and it's red, it doesn't correspond with description. Okay, so the example here is a DVD player that says it uses an infrared remote control. Well, if it used a Wi-Fi control, it doesn't match description. Now, it may work perfectly well with a Wi-Fi control. So it's not about the quality of the goods, right? It's about the description. And that's why it's an important different section, because you might buy it. Go back to the towel example. You might have a perfectly functional red towel. It's good. It's of acceptable quality. It can dry you. It can dry the floor if you disclose that purpose to the merchant, but it's not as described. Maybe you wanted a blue towel because it matches your decor or something, right? So this is about matching description. It's not about the quality of the goods. In terms of services, the two provisions we have are due care and skill. That when a service is provided, the services must be rendered with due care and skill. And again, like with Section 55, where the consumer makes known to the supplier the purpose of the services, there's a guarantee that the services and any product resulting from the services will be fit for that purpose. Okay, so if you asked a carpenter to build you a TV cabinet and said, well, it needs to be able to hold my TV, and you let them know the dimensions and weight of your TV, and if it didn't hold the weight of your TV, then it will have breached this provision, right? Because you've disclosed what you wanted to use the cabinet for, and it needs to be fit for that particular purpose. Section 64 is an interesting one because it says you can't exclude these provisions, and actually signs and statements that limit or seem to limit consumer rights are unlawful. So you can't limit, restrict, or exclude consumer guarantees. You can't avoid the obligations of this. And signs such as no refunds, no refund on sales items, exchange or credit notes only are not lawful, because you can't exclude these provisions. Now note, that doesn't mean that the supplier or the retailer has to always give money back. They only have to do this where a good isn't of acceptable quality, or it doesn't match description, or it's not fit for the disclosed purpose. Now that can be quite broad, but it also isn't everything. What can you do? Well, it depends upon what the problem is. Generally, you could ask for a refund, replacement, or get the supplier to repair the goods or resupply services to put you back in the position you would have been if you had got what you contractually are allowed to get. And remember, again, these terms, these sections, are actually statutory terms of the contract, so they're part of your contractual right. Okay, so that's a brief view of consumer transactions. I would say have a look at the checkout videos on these, because I think they give you great examples of how these consumer guarantees actually work. And next on, we'll be moving on to manufacturer's liability, the last little section we've got to do.